Good afternoon. My name is Robert Nurek. I'm a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C. And my colleague here to join us in this discussion is Galinda Nijhuis, who is head of the engagement section at NATO in Brussels. And our topic, the formal topic today, is NATO's long-term adaptation, what's on the horizon. We're not going to try to predict what's going to come out of the summit in Warsaw next summer, but we do want to talk about the issues on the agenda. And I'll first ask Galinda to talk about what she's hearing in Brussels, what are the issues there, what are the debates about, and then I'll try to give a perspective from what I'm hearing in Washington and also in this region, the Nordic-Baltic region. So first, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Robert, and thanks for having us. So, what are the big themes we are dealing with? One clearly is the whole, let's call it NATO adaptation in light of the changed security environment around us. And in the first phase following the Wales summit, I would say that the centerpiece of this largely also military adaptation has been the Readiness Action Plan, or the RAP as we refer to it. We have created the so-called Spearhead Force as a very high readiness force. We increased the NATO Response Force, nearly tripled in size. The scope of exercises and their rhythm has substantially increased. Trident Juncture just happened over the past weeks. Finished yesterday with more than 36 countries or 30 nations joining, 36,000 troops. So it was a fairly big exercise. So there is a whole strand of work which is being done in terms of adaptation. But clearly, more needs to be done. I mean, in Wales there was also the defence spending pledge. You recall, I mean, the famous 2% benchmark in investment in defence in terms of GDP, and 20% in sort of innovation and R&D. So a number of nations are making good steps in that direction. Eight or nine of them. But clearly, also there more work needs to be done. So. Then clearly, on a more political side, if you wish, we have the discussion of how do we steer and how do we define our relations with Russia in the future. And there are no immediate answers at this stage. But what I keep hearing is that yes, one could consider to work with Russia or to engage with Russia, provided it is done from a position of strength. And the two are not mutually exclusive. Au contraire, it should only happen from a position of strength. So we have that debate about how to engage with Russia. I think it's also fair to say that we have a debate about what do we do with our partners in the east and the south, who are in various degrees of turmoil. And clearly, I mean, within NATO, we cannot be at peace if we are surrounded by a ring of fire. This is a bit what we are seeing, sort of an arc of crisis, if you wish. So I think a lot of the thought is also given to what can we do more and better in order to make these partners more resilient, better equipped to look after their own security. Yeah? And therefore, probably the gist of projecting stability and projecting security without deploying forces. Yeah? Be this through the defense capacity building packages, or be this through other partnership mechanisms, is there and will probably be with us. So this just in very brief terms.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I mean, you've described a set of issues which are very much on the agenda and under discussion in Washington, and also from what I'm hearing in this region as well. Let me turn to the latter. In my dealings with officials and people from the NGO community and policy community, and in the Baltic region in particular, I'm sometimes asked, are people here happy with the results of the last summit, the Wales summit? And my sense is, by and large, the answer is yes. The question now, as you just mentioned, given as these decisions are being implemented, the question now is it enough? And a very common answer here, I think, in certain respects, is no, not enough. The focus really, and in some ways the most difficult discussion, has been on the question, broadly speaking, of presence. That is, what kind, how much and what kind of NATO forces should come into this region, on what basis. The words that I hear, when I've asked people, what do you think you need? I hear four criteria. People talk about that it's important that what comes here is visible, operationally significant, NATO, and sustained. And let me say a few words about each of those. First of all, by visible, what people mean is that it should be clear that this is new, that it's a response to the new security environment in the region, and therefore that it is communicated and seen both by Russia, but also by NATO publics. Operationally significant means, and people argue about what the standards are, but what they have in mind is something that really reinforces, in operational terms, the credibility of NATO's Article 5 commitments to deterrence and defense. But when they talk about NATO, what they mean is that it be allied. People here in particular know that, again, from an operational point of view, that the centerpiece is going to be what the U.S. does, but it shouldn't be just U.S. That it's, again, for both political and operational reasons, and it's important that there be clear participation, engagement by allies in general. And sustained means, again, there are variations about what precisely people have in mind, but that the underlying assumption, with which I certainly agree, is that what we're responding to is not, as the phrase goes, not a change in the weather, it's a change in the climate. That this is a problem we're going to be dealing with for the foreseeable future at least. And when you ask people how, in light of those four criteria, where they think they're satisfied and where not, in general, the issues are with the second and the fourth. That is, they're seeing that what's happened is visible. It is NATO. It involves a lot of other forces, not just the U.S. The questions they have is it enough in operational terms, and will it be sustained? On the former, the issue is often about this question of permanent, about force levels. What we have now, for example, is essentially in the Baltic states, basically a company in each. And you'll hear, again, variations, but a lot of calls, particularly after some analysis that says this is going to be defense, if something terrible happens, is going to be a challenge, calls for more, a brigade or more. They also, and this gets to the sustainability question, there's also this debate about what's the difference between permanent and persistent presence. I'll just give my own views. That issue doesn't interest me very much. I think the numbers do matter, but my own view is that provided that the numbers are adequate, and I do think that there's a case for more than we have now, there are also advantages to rotation. And this is the difference one difference between what people mean by permanent persistent. The advantage of rotation, as long as the numbers are preserved, is that you get more countries that are exposed to local conditions. You practice reinforcement, and if anything very bad happened, if there were real conflict, no matter what the presence is in the region, reinforcement would be critical. And there's a bit more flexibility to it as well. So I'm not worried about that part of it. But I think the big issue, or certainly the contentious issue, is going to be this question of levels. And my sense in Washington, I don't see much push now in the administration for increasing that. But that issue is on the table. I'm not sure that won't change. I expect it's going to be discussed at considerable length at the Warsaw Summit. The last thing on sustainability is one of the things that I think does need to be done, given that this is going to be that the change in the environment is not going to go away anytime soon. It has to do with the sustainability question. And at least in the U.S. case, part of the problem is the way the budgets work. What paid for the changes in U.S. presence were done, first of all, they're not even in the base budget. And that's not surprising because this happened quickly. The earlier budgets were based on very different assumptions about what that world would look like. So, but we're still at the case where this is being done year by year. And we're going to need, just as a planning matter for, at least for the U.S. Defense Department, and I would assume for other defense ministries, we need a somewhat longer time horizon, which means commitments and budgets which go more than 1 year at a time. So let me turn it back to you now. Is this some sense of what you think is going to be, without asking you to predict what people will decide, is this a sense of the sorts of things you expect you'll be hearing at the next summit?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we do have that discussion between us, but also, of course, in the with nations, in which way the current defense and deterrence posture is adequate, and one could assume that there could also be a move to revisit the current defense and deterrence posture, which was done on the basis of the 2010 strategic concept initially, and sort of factor in the new environment. I think, generally speaking, what is happening is that we'll see that our defense and deterrence capabilities have to undergo let's call it a modernization process. For example, the long periods of warning which may have existed in previous times are simply no longer there. So so you need to be quick on your feet, and the spearhead is one answer in that direction. But that in itself is clearly not enough, as you rightly pointed out. I think we also need to get better in setting the conditions for having those forces moving across nations. I mean, we have a few nations where it can take anything up to 25 days before a NATO troop can eventually move. Well, if that were to happen in a real conflict, you would have a real problem. So we need to do all the preparatory work that this does not happen. I think we have a good planning on the sustainability of the spearhead force in the coming years, so that I think that's a good progress. But for example, also still need to improve the resourcing of maritime forces. So there are resource issues to be addressed, and clearly this is something the nations themselves will have to consider doing and filling. So those aspects are definitely there. But altogether, I think what we'll probably see is a more modern, more robust defense and deterrence posture in the coming months or at Warsaw. Whether or not we'll then see at Warsaw a request for a broader strategic review remains to be seen, but it's also one option which is on the table.
Well, I'm glad you raised these matters because again, they're very much on people's minds, both in this region and in Washington. The speed issue is very interesting because, in addition to the factors that you mentioned, there's one other big issue kind of looming in the background, and that is what kind of authorities the Secretary General and SACEUR would have to move forces before the NAC comes to a consensus. And if you worry about very short warning scenarios, waiting for the NAC is something that worries people a lot. Now, it is the case, as has been pointed out, that so-called coalitions of the willing can act more quickly, but you have to plan for those too. And eventually, quickly you want to get NATO involved, as NATO, formally speaking. That issue of what the authorities are that the SACEUR and Secretary General have before the NAC comes to a consensus is actually an old issue. This was discussed a great deal during the Cold War.
Indeed.
So there are plenty of precedents for it, but it's very sensitive. And clearly whatever is decided, it would have to specify what they can do with whom and for how long before NATO, formally speaking as an institution, makes decisions about it. But I think that's another issue that's looming there.
If I may there, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, what I'm seeing is that the general attitude or the general gist is to say, well, this is a politically led organization, so it will always have to be the North Atlantic Council to decide about the deployment of forces. What SACEUR can do and is doing is to prepare and stage forces to a high degree of preparedness, so that they can be deployed at very short notice. So that's a bit the division there. But I trust it's fair to say that the NAC will retain the decision over the deployment.
It's interesting. I mean, I think that is the division. I think there will be calls for giving the SACEUR a bit more authority. Again, it'll be conditional, but to start moving some troops. And when I say conditional, it will be limited in time, it will be limited in scope. But that, because of the concerns about the speed of reinforcements, I think that issue is not going to go away. One quick final point, which you also raised, this has to do with defense spending. Again, it's very good to see the decisions at Wales. It's very important that they be these commitments to increase defense spending, to start approaching the so-called 2% of GDP benchmark, are met for two reasons. One is operational, but the other, again, now giving a U.S. perspective, is political. Because yes, it's true, this is a measure of input, not of results. It's a bit arbitrary, but it does communicate to the Congress a sense of concern. And one of the things that's important, that used to be on the table, that's off now and needs to stay off the table in the Congress, are comments from people who say, well, look, if the people in this region are not worried enough to spend more than 1%, why should we? That issue, I think that argument is now off the table. It needs to stay there, and it needs to stay there because, as you know very well, one of the issues for the U.S. and also for NATO too is that as troublesome as the East is, it's not the only thing that worries us or is on the agenda. For NATO, as you mentioned, it's the South. For the U.S., we have a global agenda, and we're all going to be making choices among these various troublesome parts of the world, and the choices, at least at the margin, are going to depend, among other things, on what kind of commitments, for Washington's point of view, what kind of commitments we see from our allies. Yeah.
No, in that respect, I think it's absolutely vital that that we maintain allied unity and solidarity across the Atlantic, because without that, we all lose.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. We already done?
Before I knew, I had to look into your eyes. What did I see? It had to be a sweet surprise.